century inspired swashbuckler, Cassius, which is Roman inspired, and If the Shoe Fits, which takes inspiration from the different Indian provinces.
Hi, I'm Anne. I'm Emily's wife. She writes, I draw, so she usually helps me with historical visual research, which I've been learning off of her. So I've worked on all of these books.
So we did, Emily and Loki and I did a variation of this panel at San Diego last year for Comic-Con, so we're going to go over the hits. Comics is changing a little bit. Nonfiction is becoming an emerging genre in the industry. So for a lot of people, that means kind of books like The Fifth Beatle, or Kate Beaton's humor work, or autobiographical work by John Lewis and Andrew Aiden and Nate Powell, March, the trilogy. This is happening in queer comics too. So we didn't invent it. Other people have been doing this a little bit before us or alongside us. Eric Shanower has been doing the version of the Trojan War for like the past 10 years. And even Hazel Newlevent, who's here tabling, has her work about lesbian jazz musicians in the early days. So this is something that's definitely changing and kind of we're part of the rising tide. We're going to start talking a little bit about Emily's work as a writer. Can you tell us about Cassius?
I sure can. Thanks, Josh. So Cassius is a epic tale heavily inspired by Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. It follows a young woman named Junia who is cursed with the mark of Cassius that is said to bring about great change. And from there on, she has to sort of disentangle herself from this strange mess that she's gotten into, all while trying to figure out who the mysterious Caesar is. For me, taking history and utilizing fiction, specifically classical literature, is one of the things I really seem to enjoy. With Cassius, it's kind of a no-brainer to take inspiration and work with Anne in creating characters and designs that really reflected certain eras of the Roman Empire, but also utilize modern fashions and ideas as well to create characters.
What was kind of the impetus for, or the spark of an idea? Was it to do like a female empowered version of the Roman
Basically,
stories?
yeah, I mean, you always see, because history is written primarily by white men, you see Roman inspired things, like say you see it on the BBC or anything like that. It's always these white British guys, specifically. You never see the actual people of Rome and Rome's other provinces, like Palmyra, and they're usually non-white, and they're a different, you want to talk about people like Hadrian having lovers, or you want to talk about, oh goodness, it's not Scipio. Anyway, there was there's a specific emperor that came to power at one point, and he was black, but they erased a lot of mention of him, just because life sucks and it's written by white men. So, but I wanted to specifically try to focus on women in the Roman Empire and bring to the forefront mainly the non-white people you would see.
Yeah, you show a much broader, more diverse, well, what we think of as the Roman Empire, which encapsulated hundreds of different cultures practically.
Exactly.
So you also
This is our project in progress.
Yeah.
It sure is. So Grave Impressions is kind of our life's work. We're currently really working on it together. It is set in Pittsburgh in 1942. It follows our main character, Howard Graves, who is kind of was the Pittsburgh word? A jagoff?
Yeah.
Who really wants to be a private eye and has no idea sort of what that entails. He's read way too many detective comics. And so he's dying to be a PI and just doesn't know that he's going to end up getting into this whole mess. But Grave Impressions specifically is, the time period itself is a character. We have gone through extensive research. I don't know if you have that.
I sure do.
Yeah. So these are from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette from the actual day in March, the advertisements and some of the other things in there that I've looked up. So I know what day Howard is going on his case. I know that the next day there will be a blizzard and what the weather was like, and that
You've
impacts
gone
his case.
extremely accurate.
I have, yeah, like I've gone to do the research, but that's part of, when I had the degree, I was like, yeah, you know what, I could just take that and utilize it, and,
What kind of sources do you, I mean, newspapers, where do you go? Do you go
Oh.
to libraries, do you go to the
yeah,
morgue?
absolutely, so libraries,
Body's still there.
Right, yeah.
Waiting for you.
well, now that we live in Pittsburgh, I mean, like.
We moved to be able to research this comic.
Yeah,
So
level of dedication is kind of gone up at this point.
go on site. That's going to be fun for the art research.
Yeah, so what we've gone through the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, what free stuff they'll let me do, so now I have to get a subscription, I'm looking forward to that. But I've taken from the newspaper articles, specifically going down to the Heinz History Museum, talking to some of the docents down there, taking pictures. We spend lots of time doing research trips where we just go down, you sketch the architecture. We went down to Eckley Mining Village, or up I should say, to Eckley Mining Village to base one of the small towns that Howard will go to later called Castle Shannon. It's a little further down from Pittsburgh. And Eckley Mining Village is a functional village still. People still live there, but it is specifically modeled off of, they shot a movie there at one point, so they've got the old coal breaker in the very back. It's just a prop, yeah. It is, yeah, they shot a movie and they just kept the prop. They're like, we'll just keep it there, it looks good, it's aesthetic. But people still live there, and all of the Pittsburgh towns, I did some research on that. All the coal mining towns, they all were based on a specific kind of plot and a plan, a land plan. So in order to figure out what Castle Shannon would look like, would have looked like then, now it just looks like a bunch of old 50s houses sitting there on top of some really unstable ground because it's all old coal mining shafts. So that was really easy for us to do, is to go to Ackley and do that.
Where does the queer identity, the sensibility fall into Pittsburgh in this era? What did you find out about it?
So for us, it was really interesting. We read Coming Out Under Fire, which
Really interesting book.
yeah, really good book about the gay men and women who served in World War II, because that will play a large part. I highly recommend that. The Queer History of America is also very good. In Pittsburgh specifically, we couldn't find a lot of mentions of queerness, but we wanted to explore a city because this is based on detective fiction. Pittsburgh had a really bad problem with smog and smoke and air pollution. So bad, in fact, that at 10 o'clock in the morning it would look like midnight. And one of the key elements of noir is the play of light and shadow. So we really wanted to utilize that. And Pittsburgh is very underutilized. When you see noir, you see Chicago, New York, San Francisco, LA, but you don't see somewhere like a rough steel town like Pittsburgh. So we really wanted to come into that. And looking up at the queer identities of the specific men and women that are going to be in the story, we tried to take instances that we were reading and primary sources from letters and try to create characters who could have really lived around that time and, been expert.
And that's kind of something we struggle with in all of our works, and we'll talk more about that as well. But records of queer people and our understanding of what a queer identity is more realized now than it's ever been. But even, people say that gay people didn't exist until Stonewall, and that's simply not true. Their journals talked about it, their family members spoke about them in hushed tones, there were details from their lives. And so a lot of what we do as kind of creators in this genre is find kind of realistic portrayals, or invent them if we have to, of what a queer narrative would be like for that era. And I think Loki, your stuff in particular is so interesting because you add a lot of genre elements that have supernatural flair.
Yeah, so for my comic, it's about world dogfighting in the 1920s, and sort of how I came about that idea is I was doing, in college I was doing research on immigrants at the turn of the century and kind of how they were treated and ostracized. And at the same time, I was doing personal research on dogfighting in the 1900s to the 1930s. And what's interesting about that is there's very little information left on dogfighting as a whole historically because people wanted to kind of blip it out of our history, and they didn't want books reprinted because they thought that the whole thing was unsavory. And while, I mean, like, you know, personally I don't agree with dogfighting, that doesn't mean you can pretend that it never existed. And so I kind of combined those two narratives of the immigrant struggle and the struggle of kind of how we viewed dogs back then, less as companion animals, though, you know, obviously some people did have like pit bull companions and all that kind of things, which were surprisingly used to be the babysitter dogs until the whole dogfighting era began a new evolution towards using pit bulls. But anyways, that's besides the point. But basically, I kind of just wanted to combine those two into a story about a young werewolf named Cage who is trying his best to kind of make something of himself in this new America, to build a space for himself and his family.
And you used like some really interesting, like you're talking about these materials. Can you talk a little bit about the assortment of reference material you've unearthed?
Yeah, so this book, the main one that I was able to use was called 30 Years of Fighting Dogs, and the reason why that one was particularly interesting is because it was written by a guy who not only fought with the dogs, but he trained them himself. And what was interesting about that, even though it was a really difficult book for me to come across because there were so many, they were not allowed to be reprinted, along with History of Fighting Dogs just recently was able to be reprinted. So, like, again, this is going back to the censorship of what they're allowed to be reprinted because they think that the material is unsavory. But with the 30 Years with Fighting Dogs, he was able to, you were able to see the mindset of what people were able to do to justify why they thought dogfighting was okay. So, for example, one line that always sticks with me is the fact that they believe that the dogs preferred to die in the dogfighting pits than they preferred to die at the home, because they were saying these were animals, these are working animals, these are not companion animals. This is what they want to die in honor and glory, then they want to die a quiet life at the home. And it was just interesting also reading, because he also delves into the fact that, like, technically it was illegal during certain periods of this, but that the police were actually the ones that were high participants in this because they enjoyed it. And so, you know, they would know which policemen were cool with it, and they would allow them to come and participate. And just kind of really weird rituals that I actually put into the comic. Like, for example, there was a practice of lacing your dog's fur with poison so that you could poison the other dog when they bit your dog. And that whole kind of delves into this comic that I worked on. And I did do a lot of visual reference. I bought Sears catalogs from the 1920s, which is amazing that you can find those because you're able to see everyday clothing, not just suits, which is really helpful. And also the work of William Decker, who basically established what, through all of his advertisement work, what the idea of the ideal man was back then. So.
Would you say it's harder to draw the period-specific clothing or the dogs? Because I know for artists, animals and feet and clothing details, these are all...
The hardest thing for me is to draw the dogs fighting because it's very impossible to find references for that. And
Yeah.
so that is the thing. Even like though I can research wolf fighting, there's actually not a lot of that either because like, you know, wolf packs typically are family units. There's that whole alpha beta thing that was established back then is actually false. That's actually self-established in zoos, but in the wild, wolves have family units, so they don't really fight to the extent that we assume that they do in human established wolf packs. So like, it's really hard for me to find references of dogs doing the things that I need them to do. Yeah, so.
Talking about kind of reference and detailing, and actually this is
this is for
your comic.
Yeah, this is for Naphrygium, which is being published through Tabula Item, which is a tarot comic anthology that's queer, so you get the book and you also get a deck of cards. And so for that, I did a historical fiction comic called Naphrygium, which is what you yell when there is a chariot crash in ancient Rome. And so this takes this story. Oh yeah. Oh, okay. So there's two things there. But yeah, the one on the left, that's from Naphrygium. So Naphrygium is it takes place during the reign of Justinian the Great, which takes place in 1550 AD. And so there's 3 layers to the relationship here, 3 things that make it super legal. So at that time, Christianity was already starting to become instilled in the Roman era, so people were starting to see homosexuality as not being a thing that is wholesome. So that is one facet to the relationship. The other facet is the fact that it is a relationship between a charioteer and a slave who builds his carts. And then the last interesting facet of that is the fact that you cannot actually have any kind of affiliation if you are anywhere associated with making chariot carts. Reason being is that there was so much social and political ties to the charioteers that you cheered for. Like literally, you know, if you supported a certain color charioteer, you're supporting the political ideals of the party of that charioteer. And so basically there's so many different reasons of why they can't be together and how they work together to try to get themselves out of this, out of the chariot racing, because it's not only the chariot racing, but Roman society as a whole that's not allowing them to be together, because like just the fact that like he is a kart racer, they just can't be together. There's just a lot of reasons why they can't be. And then the one on the right is actually a story that I'm working on with Emily, which is called The Wintering Partner, and she could talk about that one.
Yeah, the Wintering Partner one is between a, what did I say, Cree?
Cree,
Okay.
and you can see that.
Yeah. Lido and Alfara, and they are fur trappers up in the Canadian wilderness. One is, I'm sure you can guess which one is a little more brash and a little more headstrong, and one is a little more serious. And, and they get into a lot of they get into a little bit of conflict.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're looking forward to doing that one.
Yeah, so that's the one we're working on right now.
Loki, a lot of your work between the chariot racing and the dog fighting, and it's circling around sport or gambling or public
like
spectacle.
and that's just pretty much it. Like I really like blood sport, not in practice, but kind of the like social aspect behind it, like how we're able to justify why we're attracted to it and like the different aspects of history, you know, like why we love dogfighting, why we love chariot racing, even though many people died in chariot racing or gladiating, or
Gladiatorial combat?
gladiatorial combat, that's a word. I don't think gladiating is a word. So it should be. But yeah, gladiatorial combat, and just kind of how we're able to justify like these blood sports and like the spectacle of it, and how the different morals of the time will shape what is allowed and what is illegal in the different societies. And we'll go kind of in waves where we'll be like, oh, this is totally fine, this is totally illegal, and then be like, oh no, morality-wise, we can't be into this. And how we'll just kind of circle around.
What do you think the dog fighting of today is, besides dog fighting?
What do you mean the dog fight?
What's the thing now that someone's going to be making a queer historical comic about in 30 years?
Oh God, I mean like, well, for me being Filipino, like there's a very big emphasis for growing up on boxing, because the boxing champion was Manny Pacquiao, the Filipino boxer. So I mean, I wouldn't have any poems about queer boxing. I mean, I'm pretty sure people here would read it. Like, I'd love that, or kickboxing or MMA fighting. I'm fine with all of that. If any of you guys want to make that, I would be right there.
So I'm gonna take what you said about kind of changing mores and laws and how that we're kind of affected by the society, the era we live in, and that's a focus of my work. For Love Machines, and it's a collection of stories from different creators. I'm the writer, I work with different illustrators, but they're all love stories about technology, past, present, and future. So whether that be how bicycles are literally a vehicle for women's empowerment in the late 1800s, or how an iron lung facilitates intimacy between a patient and a caregiver, or about a celebrity mannequin who was on the cover of Life magazine in the 30s. A lot of my research is kind of finding different eras and figuring out what the most important innovation of the era was, or exploring what connection we have to inanimate objects and machines. The one I'm probably most proud of is this issue 5, which is about the mannequin. Her name is Cynthia. You can see her in a real photograph on the bottom right. She was like a pre-Kardashian Kardashian. Before her, all mannequins were made of wax. They had human hair and glass eyes, and they weighed 200 pounds, and they were terrifying. So she's the first of kind of the intentionally imperfect Art Deco mannequins you would see today. And so that's her creator, Lester Gaba, and he's a pre-gay gay guy. Because the term homosexual didn't exist until I think the 1850s in Germany, and then gay is like really a modern invention. And so he lived a pretty comfortable, what we call out life in Manhattan in the 30s, but also in the way that the media would cover him, they would treat her like he was his beard, like she was his beard. Like they would treat them like a real couple, and he really played that up to kind of bask in the fame. But that put him kind of in a collision course with other gay men, homosexuals, who would want to live more secretive lives. He carved her out of soap originally, and so like this is all stuff that I had to look up. Like there's not, the Wikipedia entry isn't terribly complete, but I went to New York City to find his will, to try to find the mannequin. He wrote a window display review column every week for 30 years. It's just a completely, all the stuff of his life, window dressing, mannequins, soap carving, like no one cares or thinks about that anymore. And a lot of what queer history really is finding kind of esoteric elements that have fallen to the wayside, whether that be the regal history of dogfighting or the more diverse Roman era. And so sometimes we create something entirely new or kind of use different trappings. Anne, do you want to talk more about Duel? Or Emily, whoever wants to talk
Yeah, this
about
is
it.
Emily's brainchild. It's kind of a genderqueer swashbuckling story.
I love Duel. Duel comes out of the tradition of like old-fashioned swashbucklers. And when we immediately think swashbuckling, we think pirates. But the original term was not meant for that. It was meant for this sort of Scarlet Pimpernel, Zorro, Robin Hood sort of thievery. And
A little bit outside of society.
yeah, definitely outside of society. Duel comes about in the really fun tradition of 17th and 18th century sort of thumbing of gender norms. Specifically, Duel is heavily inspired by the Chevalier d'Eon, who got an anime. I don't know if you guys have seen that, it's pretty good, but other than that, d'Eon was a French diplomat, a spy and a soldier, and for the last 33 years of their life, they dressed as a woman, and they're someone who has had a lot of historical, I guess, research and debate done on them, specifically looking now into gender politics and gender identity in the 1700s. And they were a secret handmaiden to the Empress Elizabeth of Russia for a very long time as a woman, yes. And so, but they all lived a life where they sort of went back and forth and were very happy in either gender role. And specifically with also the Empress Elizabeth, that also kind of comes from this. She really enjoyed throwing masquerade parties where the men would dress in women's gowns and the women would dress in the men's work. And she liked that, and you had a really good point on that. You were telling me that she liked that mainly because she thought she had great legs, and she wanted to show them off, but also with the writing thing.
Yeah, she was really sporty, so it was about done riding side saddles. She just took on men's clothes, because she was also really into the military. She was the granddaughter of Peter the Great, who kind of made Russia, Imperial Russia, into what it became. So she was kind of a tearaway, like her grandfather. She was really into sports and military stuff, so she would cross-dress a lot.
And Duel sort of just comes out of the love of that era that we both, oh yeah, that's great. Those are really good. Nice cross, Josh. Those are really good, but yeah, that comes out of that era that we have the love for this sort of frilly rococo baroque
Over the
combination.
top.
Oh, absolutely. And what were you saying about? Oh,
Well,
sorry. Yeah.
And these are not simple outfits to draw. Like if I were to do a comic, it would be about people wearing potato sacks.
French peasants,
Can you
then.
talk a little bit about your technique and what media you used to create this page?
It's interesting on the research on this, because I joked with Emily, like, I'm very impressions, we want it to be historically accurate.
Yeah.
So I have whole bookshelves for that of like pictures and resources, and ImageMorph is unbelievable on it, like an external hard drive. And I tried with Cassius, we bought books, and again, I did like actual source historical research. And then we got to Duel, and I went, but we essentially want it to be floofy and over the top, and like in the spirit of the rich lives of the European nobles that made the Rococo period what it was. So I threw my hands up and I ended up going on Pinterest and just finding anything, either modern imitation Rococo and Baroque or historical or otherwise, and kit matching stuff. So we were talking about actually, like, when you do historical stuff, you have to know, like, you have to have a sense of, like, how accurate you want it to be and why you are, like, busting your butt to make it that accurate, and when you should, like, keep the spirit of the times, but not, like, you don't always have to, like, kill yourself with the references. And
No, and I think
you can mix stuff.
there's a bad habit of artists sometimes where they will have a hyper detailed outfit or character design, and they want to draw as much attention to the work they did as possible. And I mean, just look at the way that like you frame the pages. Like it's very much about the characters and not about what they're wearing.
Yeah, you have to be comfortable enough with, if you're going to draw something detailed, you have to commit to, don't design it unless you think you can draw it like at least 100 or 500 times, because that's what you're going to be doing. And you see some people where it's like the main character is really detailed and everything else around it, like they let it go. If you're going to put a character that detailed, I mean, if you look at Rococo, I'm really interested in architecture, if you look at Rococo architecture, it is gilt and swirly and white and crusted plaster, brilliant. You have to be willing to draw that in a background.
So are these did you do these in traditional media, or is it all digital, or?
I did it in liner pens, and I penciled it and did it in liner pens, and then I scanned it, and because we were in a hurry for Emerald City, Emily flatted for me, and then I adjusted the colors. So. I usually color, unless I'm doing watercolor work, like as the shoe fits, I usually color digitally just because it's faster.
Do you want to talk a little bit about if the shoe fits? I don't have a slide for it.
No, it's
but-
fine.
You want to talk, Em?
It's not great, it's your process. Like, it's your-
Oh, it's, okay, well, do you want to say what it is?
Sure, it's a gay retelling of Cinderella. It's done entirely in traditional watercolors. We tried to take out the Western European feel for it, so it is heavily inspired by India and some of the Indian wedding fashions. And it was really fun to get to do this, but it was also a really great lesson in working with, I guess, just different cultures and whatnot. We had to have a couple of experts come in and talk. Like we talked with them because I know that Hinduism is intertwined with the culture, so you can't just have the culture and the religion separately. So with the feet thing, feet are both sacred and also forbidden really to touch in a certain way. So you have to be very careful in the way that that's done and represented, and try to do it in a very respectful manner. So in this, we have them stepping into the shoes, but no one's actually ever touching them. So that was, because it's Cinderella, it was kind of important to make sure that, you know.
It's worth asking someone for a consult, especially if you're working with a culture, even historically, it's not your own.
Yeah, absolutely, it's the your process.
Yeah, this was watercolor, so it's just basically big sheets that are like about that big. And I penciled and inked like normal, and then just because it's traditional colors, you kind of have to pay attention to whether it's like what's going to digitize well, and also if you don't want to be painting this when you're 60, you have like 4 pages taped down in sets, like 4 or 5 at once, because when you're waiting for something like this to dry, you want to do washes over these 3 and leave them alone and come like work on these ones over here, and then when that has to dry, because it has to dry in stages, you come back to the first set where you peel them off and you peel off a step from like yesterday and do washes. And then you also have to worry about, like with digital color, you'll sample, like you'll have a color palette and you'll sample from the previous page and keep using that so that it looks like the same scene one page to the next. And this is a matter of like, you have to number, I think I ended up either numbering or labeling the colors on the palette, and then I had lists on the side of what colors were used in what scenes. So if you're coming back to something after it dries the next day, you don't pick up colors from a palette that doesn't go with that scene, because otherwise page 9 won't match page 10.
Right.
So
it's a beautiful work. I definitely recommend checking them all out, of course. But if the shoe fits is such a great example of kind of doing a fantasy setting and infusing it with a lot of cultural sensibility and research. And I think there's a lot of stuff that is maybe heavily inspired by Mobius, by Akira Toriyama, by a lot of these, by Disney greats. And those illustrators were trained in the masters, and they have a rich cultural background and knowledge of those eras. And sometimes on Tumblr you just see, oh, they're really good at drawing Lilo and Stitch. Or like they're Gundam meets Lilo. Or
It's really interesting to see like the French illustration tradition, which is where I take a lot of my inspiration, because they have, like if you look at European comics, you had talked about the renaissance that's happening in American comics or nonfiction, and things that are not Cape Comics, like Latin minute to Cape Comics is happening. Europe has had that for like the past 50 years. It's really interesting to go look at French comics, because there can be people like Pierre Allery and trying to remember just the watercolors. Does the Seven Sportsmen?
Oh, I forgot.
I'm blanking, but there's a whole bunch of Mobius. There's a whole bunch of these Italian and French artists.
I'm waiting for Japanese food comics to make it in America.
Yes, please.
So start, call your comic shops today. Moving on, Levi, can you tell us a little bit about our work together?
Yeah, so Declaration came from an idea. We had this discussion, I don't know, maybe a little over a year ago. Just sort of this, there wasn't really a lot of queer historical fiction around the American Revolution, and it's a period of time that we are both very interested in and have kind of come to independently, but we had just talked about, I think even just not even very informally, like, wouldn't it be fun if we did this thing? And then it kind of became a more tangible idea. But we wanted to, explore the, what would it be like at the sort of dawn of the revolution to kind of like, just sort of explore the lives of these characters who are falling in love and trying to have a relationship at a time that is fraught for so many different reasons, and particularly at a time when, obviously it was still very taboo and not acceptable, but also during, even when very well established people are, their status is being threatened. And we think today about sort of the inevitability of the American Revolution and like, oh, well, clearly we won, and so clearly, but at the time, there was a lot of anxiety, there was a lot of uncertainty about what was actually going to happen and what was actually at risk in these people's lives. And so we wanted to tell a story not from like the point of view of like the generals and politicians and like the heroes, but kind of ordinary people and the anxieties and realities that they faced. So that was sort of our starting point.
Yeah, there's like a bad joke in historical circles that like the American Revolutionary War was fought by 8 people. And if you read books about it, they're all hanging. It's always like it's one of 8 people. It's like Washington or Hamilton or Adams and it's like tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people were involved in this war, and we don't know anything about the rest of them. And I was particularly, to get to the homoerotic nature of the work, it's these men would write the beautiful flowery letters to each other. George Washington, and it was a bit of a dick measuring contest, and because they wanted to show how educated they were, and the way to do that was by using illustrative language, and so it comes across as love letters. But also, love and marriage were different things in the era too, as they might be today. But then especially, and so it's very easy to read between the lines and see where there were openings. I know you, Levi, you've mentioned them all huddled up on Bunker Hill for an entire winter.
Yeah, I mean, there are all these stories about, it was Valley Forge actually.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay, but like, one of those like cold, brutal winters where it's like, they're basically like having to like dogpile for warmth, and there are actually some stories about in which there were a couple of soldiers that were actually banished from the army, like for sodomy, essentially. Like so.
Yeah, George Washington.
That was something you would be prosecuted for. But at the same time, like one of Washington's generals who came over who was brought over from Germany, was sort of a notorious homosexual. Like so there were the different standards, obviously based on class and class and wealth and your military status. So it's like there were different strata at which you could get away with this behavior and different areas in which it was unacceptable. And for us, like we really wanted to, our two characters in question are from very different social classes, because that was another kind of conflict that we wanted to explore. One is very working class farmer who's very just like, I just want to do my job and have a nice life. Whereas the other is a much more, he's much more wealthy, aristocratic, and has all of these high ideals. He's very educated. And so he has these like very optimistic, rosy outlook about like, yes, let's, break off in England and throw off these shackles and create this wonderful new utopia in America. And I think the story that we kind of want to explore is like facing the realities of what's actually at stake.
Yeah, and so this is some of the reference material. You and I are both based on the West Coast, so we don't have any original sources we can get to so easily. We can't go to Colonial Williamsburg yet.
No.
But do you want to talk a little bit about your process? These are some, one of the top right is one of the earliest sketches I think you did for it.
Yeah, it started with just some general character sketches, and there's a huge wealth of references in terms of old portraiture and paintings from the era, which I'm drawing a lot from to flesh out the more aristocratic character and the settings there. The harder stuff is more of the working class, everyday figures and settings for that. There's much less material available.
Yeah, I mean there were no photographs. What we do have are some sketches or some old buildings, and quite frankly, there wasn't a lot of interest in capturing what it was like being poor.
Right. There's some engravings. But yeah. So again, sort of this like there wasn't a lot of documentation of the poor working class. So in a way, like there's it's a little more challenging to find those references, but at the same time, that also gives us a little more freedom to kind of build in our own, flesh out our own visuals, because there isn't a lot of references, so there's not a lot of people who are going to be wagging their fingers at us if we fudge the facts a little bit. Because also, like, we're not being, we're telling a historical romance, but we're not trying to be 100% historically accurate. So, again, it's sort of like we want to capture the character and the feeling of the time, but without, we're not starting the college course on
Yeah.
this.
So we're going to open it up to questions in just a moment. So, I mean, there's a lot of resources available to creators, and probably Emily and Loki and I can talk specifically about that. This is One Magazine. It's one of the earliest homosexual publications, and it's filled with these gorgeous cartoons, mostly drawn by people under an assumed alias. And so that's very interesting. This is one of, let's get gay marriage in the 1960s. Like, that's pretty edgy, considering people are trying to stop it now. One place I look to, which is based in Southern California, is the One Archives Foundation. They've been really helpful in being able to, they're the largest collection of LGBTQAI material in the country. They have old erotica magazines from the 30s, they have love letters, they have sex toys, they've got posters, it is a full, the only problem is there just isn't enough time to curate it all. And a lot of this stuff is very steeped in context and kind of like oral tradition. And that's something we struggle against because we homosexuals do not reproduce so easily. Loki, do you want to talk maybe a little bit about, have you done any on-site research or are there any specific online resources you turn to?
I did do on-site research for Until the Lost Language. Unfortunately, I'm also based on the West Coast and it is sort of based on the East Coast. I did do research at one of the houses that was built in, I believe, 1910 or 15 in Oregon. God, where is it? But it was basically where I based the house that is in Until the Last Dog Dies off of that house because they were able to basically preserve that house and preserve a lot of like how they did refrigeration back then and how they cooked back then. And they have like, they have a really fun tuberculosis room there. And the fun tuberculosis room where, you send the tuberculosis people outside to clear the, it's like full of windows and light, so, and also keeps them away from everyone else. So, you have the TV room over there. And so like, it was really fun exploring that house because they basically kept it as it was lived in back in those times. And I'm sorry I'm blanking on exactly where the location is. I believe it's somewhere in the Beaverton area in Oregon. And so that was really interesting because they have a lot of information there. I did a lot of sketches there. Literally, the library that the scene in chapter 3 takes place in is lifted out of the library that is from there. And I was just like, I like this library. This is exactly what I want it to look like. And I took a bunch of pictures from all examples I knew that I would need. And then in regards to just archives and that kind of thing, there's the Outlook magazine, which is it's an LGBT academic magazine where people would send in essays and they would do a lot of research on, for example, they just sent me an issue because they want me to illustrate for it, but they did a whole study on the Zuni third gender and how it was really hard for them to, they did a lot of research on this particular figure from 1910, but then the thing is it was hard for them to understand because their use of the term of pronouns is different than our use of pronouns, and how pronouns are based off of how their pronouns are based off your birth sex, but then also there is another pronoun that is for the job that you're holding. And so if you're holding a mat, so they have this figure that that they used, women's jobs, but then they would have female pronouns, but also male pronouns for this person. And so that's a really cool archival to look up. And the other article that was super interesting was lesbian nuns and how a lot of how the decline of nuns in the modern era, but also how a lot of lesbian women would find love in nunneries. And so that one's really cool. That one's called Outlook, and you can find PDFs of them online, and I think they're doing their 30th anniversary. And there's a lot of academics that are in there doing stuff like that.
So Emily, I know you and Anne have shifted where you live for on-site research. But can you want to touch a little bit on that, or maybe some online resources?
Yeah. No, we fell in love with the city kind of before we were doing Great Compressions, so that was. That's kind of
why
a
we
bonus.
said
Yeah, that's kind of why we said it there, but that just happened to be a bonus. I don't know, part of when I got my degree in history, my concentration was in public history, so when we first met, I was working temporarily at an Air Force museum, working in the archives back there, but working with their special collections. So one of our first dates was I took her into the back of the special collections room and was like, here, you want to see the guns? Because of some of the connections I have, we are able to go talk to some of the archivists and talk to some of the curators. And I'm currently working on trying to talk to somebody at the Heinz Museum. But I think museums are one of the biggest just sources of information. And if you just ask somebody, whatever kind of, do you have anything else in the collections here? Sometimes you can reserve a time to go, it depends on the museum, if they're small enough, sometimes you can reserve time to go in the back to see the other collections.
The collection's always bigger than what's on display.
I was shocked just in my research for Love Machines how much, when I lived in LA, the LA Central Library has millions of documents that they don't have on display, and they're happy to show you any of them. You just have to know what you're looking for, and sometimes that means a long afternoon talking to doddering old docents to get help from. And so, if you are a queer creator and you want to create comics and you're not really sure how, please talk to us, of course. But there are organizations like Geeks Out on the East Coast or Prism Comics here on the West Coast. And definitely, I would say, try to look us up and be our friends online. So if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand.
Yeah. Just kind of phrase it. I suppose there's a documented famous thing with historical academia in terms of the modern day values and presuppositions of modern historians coloring and flavoring their observations archaeological evidence. So, particularly I was looking up it's where you get wonderful phrases like good friends, Niang Knum and Knumhotet, to ancient Egyptian high officials that were buried together, and they were like, oh, those were really good friends. No, they were buried together.
As friends.
And I think similar thing with male and female coding of certain things, like female remains found buried with swords. And it's like, oh, must have been for ritual purposes or symbolic purposes, you know, denying any observation that in that culture, women might be warriors, or that female body may have identified as male, or anything like that. I just, wondering your general, well, first of all, do you think that part of the onus of breaking down those suppositions is on authors and writers and artists and so on?
I think the removal of bias is something that I studied we studied very heavily when I was getting my degree. So like the minute you said that, I was like, oh, I know what this is. Excellent, yeah, this is my thing. I kind of feel like there's a little bit of a responsibility to remove the bias that you have seen beforehand, but again, you're going to come into this with some sort of bias anyway, because I'm a queer person writing about queer things. I'm already going to be a little biased.
You're going to be biased towards the queer,
Right.
people who came before you were biased against.
Right.
Hundreds and hundreds of years.
Exactly. So it's finding this interesting balance, but also being okay to tip that over a little and being like, well, you know, everybody said for so long they're just good friends. Let's just wipe that off the table and go with gay lovers instead, or whatever, you know. So yeah, I think that there's always going to be some kind of bias in whatever any kind of research you're looking for, and it's being able to see between the lines and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the thing I was going to bring up, that's like the old world ancient history, but when you go up into like the even 1800s, where you get more written history in the last couple of centuries, because we have talked about they literally don't have the vocabulary for what's going on that we have today. Part of this can be learning not just where historians might have glossed over it and made it look straighter, but also the people of the times when they were like writing letters to each other or writing about things. You see it in novels too. You have to, it's almost like learning the language. It's what I've been learning from her. So you can read a certain novel, and if you, once you know like the code or the language,
I know which one you're talking about.
yes, you can talk, she can talk more in depth about this, but like if you read noir fiction, which is essentially white male insecurity fiction.
White men reacting badly to change.
Badly to change, yes. The elements of noir fiction. If you read the most famous noir fiction, The Maltese Falcon, and you know, if you're aware of what the gay coded words are at the time, that book is incredibly homosexual.
Yeah.
So is there like polarity kind of elements in there or something?
So Dashiell Hammett was kind of a cheeky little bastard, and he enjoyed pulling one over on his editors. So he called one of the, it's Wilmer is the name of the guy. He's the fat man's right-hand gunslinger, but he calls him a gunsel. And gunsel, back in those days, was the name for a young man who enjoyed bottoming. But everyone assumed it meant gunslinger or somebody who handled guns, so that's how gunsel became in the modern vocabulary. That's what it becomes now, the lexicon. Gunsel is someone who uses guns. But if you knew what it was in the 1920s, that's what it was. So
It's blatantly in the
it's
book.
very blatantly, yeah.
He gets all this past the editor.
Oh, yeah.
You can read in other historical documents too, though, because there's also things like you can learn to read the dress code, because nobody could say, oh, yes, hi, I'm Anne, I'm a lesbian,
Yeah.
because you might get in trouble, but it's things about the dress code for like men where if you had a red tie and you had a matching pocket handkerchief,
In the 1940s.
this was telling you something about this guy's preferences in the 1940s. So you can get like little subtle, almost visual language too, and start to read that.
Yeah, because like, sorry, just to give things, like the ancient Egyptian example, in the lines of the two, are the two figures nose to nose.
Yeah.
And you need to understand in the historical context, nose to nose is like, they're making out.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, the goal of all of our works, I think, is to make queer people visible throughout history and try to make, and it is hard to, like with revolution, or like with Declaration, we don't want to go too far into the Harlequin romance of it. We do want to make a grounded, realistic portrayal as much as we're able to. And I think some of that is just those narratives have been erased from history, or we just don't have the language to, they didn't have the language to describe how they were feeling, let alone the people around them. So we probably have time for a couple more questions. Oh,
I was wondering if you ever looked into the Eleanor Roosevelt work outside of the White House and friendships that she had.
I know what you're talking, yeah, I've heard of
her
Eleanor
road
Roosevelt.
trips.
Yeah.
Best friends, something like that she worked with on different charities and organizations.
I have heard a lot about Eleanor Roosevelt and have never done the research myself, but I've always thought she was a very interesting woman who, I've always thought she might have been a little queer, but that's just my personal opinion.
I'm not going to be president's guy, so the first ladies are tangential to that, but I definitely like, I do think that, well, Eleanor Roosevelt surrounded herself with lesbians, period.
Yeah.
She definitely championed their causes, and I think had she been able to get, you know, she always pushing for equality and social, and there were even when FDR was president, there were pretty public jokes at the expense of Eleanor Roosevelt is leaving her husband to hang out with a bunch of women, and we all kind of know what that means.
Yeah.
And they were afraid to talk about him being, you know, being trapped to having polio, trapped to a chair. But they're all too happy to talk about the fact that his wife's running off without Secret Service protection to go, you know, go to jazz age bars. Okay. Well, we'll just have everyone say where they can be found online or what have you. We'll start off with you, Ann.
I live on Tumblr and Twitter and Instagram, mostly Twitter, and any other social media site you like. I'm usually under my actual name, Ann Yulin, or also Nymaulth, Nymaulth, and she and I have a business card up in our table, so.
What's next for you? What's next?
Probably another,
We've got a longer idea for Duel. I'm finishing another short, and then we've got a longer.
Good.
and then Greg impressions.
Yeah, Grave Impressions, because that's an ongoing research project. And that's where I cannot wait to start putting online.
And then you can find me pretty much anywhere as Birdie Writes. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, those are my two big things. And yeah, if you find me, find her.
Yeah.
I'm Loki. You can find me at mrloki.com or Mr. Loki Doki on Twitter or Instagram. I'm working on Until the Last Dog Dies, Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 right now. I'm also working on A Wintering Partner with Emily. And then I'm also illustrating a short story about a Mongolian centaur who serves under Genghis Khan.
You can find me at Levi Hastings Art on Instagram and Twitter primarily. Also on Facebook, but I post not as much there. Yeah, or just my website, levihastings.com. I have a lot of stuff available on my store, and currently working on the first full-length issue of Declaration. This is the preview issue out now. And working on some comics for Beyond Anthology Volume 2, and a couple of other top-secret exciting projects.
And I'm Josh Trujillo. You can find me at Lost to Skisman or at joshtrujillo.com. And there's more Love Machines issues coming out, and Levi and I have a Declaration, and that's it. Thanks for coming.